In this interview, you'll hear from Dr. Julie Goldman, Director, Equity, Curriculum and Instruction in the Equity Department. An expert in the writing and implementation of many large-scale grants, Dr. Goldman shares insights from lessons she's learned along the way. Factors she identifies as key to successful grant processes include clear communication, ample documentation and data collection, and persuasive storytelling.
So welcome. If you wouldn't mind, maybe we can start by having you share your name, your title, and the department that you're with.
Thank you. My name is Julie Goldman, and I am Director of Equity, Curriculum, and Instruction in the Equity Department.
Wonderful. And Julie, what has your experience been with grants, either at SDCOE or even prior to joining us?
Over the last about 20 years, most of that time at SDCOE, also in 2 different districts, I've worked on, written, and implemented about 12 really large-scale grants and dozens of smaller grants. I've helped to secure them, either been part of the writing or the implementation of many, many grants.
So it sounds, Julie, like you've had a lot of experience. I would say you're probably at an expert level with your experience and exposure to grants. You've had small scale grants, you've had some large state, some federal grants. So there's probably a lot of lessons learned in between all of that experience. And I'm just wondering if you could share with our colleagues, what are some of those lessons you walked away with from your grant experience? What's the good, the bad, and the ugly that we should be familiar with when we're working with grants?
Writing of a grant is a lot like telling a story. You're really trying to show this make a compelling case for why your plan, and just telling the story with the data, with research, with the context that you're setting up. And the implementation of a grant is a lot like, it's the production phase. Like, that's almost like an orchestra conductor. You know, you might take some time and work with the woodwinds or work with different sections, but it's all in service of having this flow and having people be able to accomplish what you set out to do. So some of the things that I've really learned, and they're super simple to do, is like meeting weekly. We've had large rescale research grants where we think, oh, well, we don't really need to meet with the leadership team. Even if we don't, there's so many other things that happens during those weekly meetings. Sometimes there's side projects, there's related projects. It's just the relationship building. So maybe we don't need the 30-minute meeting, but we'll only meet for 10 or 15 minutes, but we still touch base weekly. And who's ever on vacation is on vacation, but kind of keeping that time reserved. And I think one of the other components would be really paying attention to the details. The details matter when you're implementing a grant. Communication is key. Relationships are absolutely key. If you see that, you know, somebody is struggling with something, you can, if you have that ongoing communication, you can resolve issues before it might snowball. So staying connected, taking notes of everything, like every single meeting, keeping notes, even if you think I'll remember that later, we really won't, because we have so many different things that we're juggling. So we just jot down having some system for saying, I met with Gabby at this time and this is what we discussed, and here's the summary. Monitoring, color coding, and then following up, because if you have those notes and then you have your next steps or your to-dos, you can just have this, an hour during the week that you say, I'm going to do all my follow-up.
I love those tips. And although they may sound simple, I would agree with you in that they're key and can sometimes be overlooked because that's part of the project management piece. And so part of it, I think, is having our colleagues know that it's taking the time to provide and create these systems that can set you up for success. So I appreciate you highlighting just a few that you have found helpful. I agree with you. I love keeping a notepad and a pen, and it gives me comfort. But I have found it's a hard habit to break, but I hear your amazing tip of keeping some type of record. And I've moved really hard to try to just be electronic. And so even if, like you're saying, if the meeting doesn't seem like, well, it's not a formal meeting, even just keeping track of that so that you can go back to your OneDrive or your Google document later, because you're right, we'll forget. And we say, where was that Post-it? I left that on, or where my notebook. It just makes a lot more sense that in this day and age, we use those electronic tools that are at our disposal. So thank you for highlighting that one. And it's one that I still like my little notepad because I like having the check off, but I also know it's important to use an electronic tool so that we keep a running record. So thank you for the reminder. With the different grants that you have helped to implement, sometimes we get really excited when we get that award letter, and then we say, oh my gosh, we got these dollars and we're going to do amazing work for students and families and teachers. And then we move into the implementation phase. At SDCOE, there's a lot of processes and protocols, and sometimes we're aware of all of them and sometimes we're not. What have been some of the best practices that you have followed to try to navigate SDCOE's processes once we get that award letter? What do you think might be helpful to an SDCOE employee who just received an award? What are those recommendations you might have?
Well, definitely to work with your department, because I think having that streamlined process, the checklist, a lot of documents that we might need for those initial the initial processes, you already have the letters ready to go and we can just adapt them. So touching base with you, touching base with our team, I think a lot of the same items that I mentioned before with the having that checklist, the monitoring, the knowing what's expected and following up and communicating with everyone, and having a plan and moving forward with that. Now, with that said, we do have projects that sometimes there's a glitch or there's a problem with the timeline or a problem with the funding, and we do need to be adaptive and flexible and kind of go with that and revamp and still move forward with it.
Yes, I know you've had a lot of experience recently with a lot of budget revisions for a large state grant, and the back and forth that sometimes ensues. When we get that award, sometimes it needs to be tweaked from the funder side. Sometimes it might need to be tweaked from our side. So I know that required a lot of patience and diligence on your part. So congratulations on having that particular budget finally resolved. You mentioned data earlier, and I know you've worked with a lot of evaluators. You have had a lot of federal grants that included some large evaluation pieces. I'm just curious, what are those lessons learned for keeping track of the data, or perhaps even highlighting the data to demonstrate all of the amazing work that can come from a grant? What are some tips you might have around that?
Well, definitely with your evaluator, some of it you have control over and some of it you don't. For example, we had a large scale research grant that the way that the data had to be collected from the federal end, it was around long-term English learners. And as our students did so well because of the project that we were leading, they were actually leaving the study. So we were we were collaborating with our evaluators, but we were able to talk about it anecdotally and brainstorm again in those weekly meetings and think of how can we still highlight this the great results of this work, because in the final analysis, all of these grant projects that we're doing are to, provide students opportunities that they might not otherwise have in their teachers, and to improve outcomes for students. So regarding the evaluators, I think, again, some of it we have control over, some we don't have control over. So the things that we do have control over are the planning and the structure and the evaluation plan, and our theory of action, and really making sure that all those pieces are well thought out in advance. If you can work with an evaluator, if you do know that an RFA is going to be coming out in 6 or 8 months, and you can be building that relationship and maybe even have like a monthly meeting with them, and they can deepen their understanding of your project, this will, just create a better evaluation design. A, you'll be more likely to get funded, and B, you can structure something that will really highlight your project and program.
Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes when our colleagues hear the word grant, sometimes I get people that want to run the opposite direction because they think, oh, I've never done that, or this seems like a lot of work. And again, I don't maybe have experience with that. And they maybe have heard some horror stories about grant applications that consume you for weeks, and projects that can take over quite a bit of your calendar. So being truthful, what have been some of the challenges that you've encountered implementing grants?
Definitely that what you just mentioned with the timeline. Sometimes these are very quick turnaround times. And so you truly have to clear your schedule. It's not something that you can work kind of part-time on a grant. If you have a grant coming up, it's like, you have to be concentrating on that. And the reality is, most of the time, if you have like a 2-week or a 3-week window that you're working on a grant, you're probably working evenings and weekends, and that is way more than a full-time job. It's just not something that you can say, okay, it's 5:30 now, I'm going to wrap this up. So it's a big commitment and it's a big undertaking. But if you're selecting what projects you want to take on, you can decide, is this really leveraging the work that we're already doing? And you kind of go through a vetting process to decide if it's a right fit for your department in your projects. So definitely the timeline, over the years, because I've been at the county for a while, there is a longer window now that we have to get it in, which, it completely makes sense. But sometimes it's just not possible. It just depends on the project.
So Julie, the timeline for submitting the grant, we all know, can usually present a challenge. Now, when you're implementing, what are some of the hiccups that you've encountered that you've been able to work through, but that might be helpful for us to consider?
You can't go outside of, what the grant has already you've already established in the grant, even though you might need to. But it's also a plus for grants, because sometimes in projects you might think, oh, I could go in this direction or that direction, and with a grant, these are my goals, these are my objectives, you have a scope of work, you have a management plan, so it really gives structure to the work. Mm-hmm. And you just looking for those opportunities for innovation as you're implementing. For example, we had a research grant, and we were focused on teachers' sense of efficacy and teaching literacy to English learners. But we really noticed when we were working with the formative assessment piece that teachers' biases were surfacing in this process. And although it wasn't like part of that research and it was outside the scope of our goals and objectives, we were able to make note of that, work it into our evaluation report, and use it to leverage future work. So then when we applied for an equity grant, we were able to use that learning to weave it up into a new project. Similarly, in that same project, we also noticed that the schools where the students were just redesignating and really doing so well in the project, they were the principals, the leaders really understood the scope of work. And although it wasn't a requirement for the grant, it was a noticing that we had. And again, we were able to use this and leverage this information for future projects. So although when you're implementing a project, some of the data collection might be out of the scope of work, absolutely, like, take note of that. And that's where your notes in your data collection and conversations and whatnot, the relationships that you're building with the researchers, with our community partners, are so beneficial, because then you can be thinking, oh, there's all of these other opportunities. And in the final analysis, like, grants are just like putting together a big puzzle, and all the pieces need to be, aligned. So it needs to be the right time for your team. You need to have the capacity. You need to have somebody who can, dedicate a solid 2-3 weeks to the project. You need to have the researchers, the evaluators. A lot of times for research grants, you have to have the district with X amount of schools, if it's treatment and control and whatnot. So once you have all of those pieces in place, then you're implementing, you get awarded the grant, you're implementing, and you'll be noticing that there are other opportunities to create these other puzzles outside of your own. You stay within the confines of, focused on your project, but also leverage your noticings and learnings to build new and dynamic projects.
Any other thoughts or recommendations or lessons that you've learned along the way that you want us to consider?
One of the things I've learned over the years is to start with the goals and objectives and start with the deliverables in the management plan really early on, like map out that timeline, start with the end in mind, really take the time to unpack the RFA, which your department really helps to do that. Back in the day, we used to do that on our own. So that's really a time saver. And spend that time to map it out before you start to write, before you do the lit review part, because once you have your goals and objectives, maybe theory of action, the rest of it kind of writes itself. It'll just fall into place. But I've seen a lot of times where people start to the last thing you should do is write the abstract, but sometimes just start writing the grant or start going through the process. And that is definitely one of the things that I've learned over the years, is to start with the goals and objectives and management plan. What are your deliverables? Are those doable? Do you have all of the components that you'll need? And work from there.
That's a great one. It makes me think oftentimes when we're assessing whether or not it's the right time, you spoke to that earlier. Do you have the bandwidth? Is it the right time? That when people are in that writing mode, that one of the questions could be, what need is this going to address, right? So that we can really then align. Is there a need that we're looking that hasn't been met? And how will this grant be able to do that? Right. So that it becomes focused on students and the need that our districts have. And so I think it's just taking that a little step further of these are questions we have to pose to ourselves if we haven't pulled that data from the field to say, this is what's generating that need, which is why we are going to put in this work and lose a little bit of sleep along the way to apply, because we know that a need hasn't met. So I would add to that one as well. Any other lessons learned?
Yeah, a recent one, when we know and we're anticipating that a grant is going to be coming down the road in a couple of months, start to your point of the districts and knowing the needs, start to survey the districts, survey the educators or parent liaisons, community members who will be impacted from this work, and gather that, and that can really help in the storytelling process. So if we don't think of it as, there's not a magic formula to write a grant, but if we do think of it as telling this compelling story about a need and why we need to accomplish this, it makes it feel a lot more doable. And
so with all of the different grants that you've helped write and implement, what has been your greatest joy in doing that work?
Definitely the relationships, the innovation, knowing that we're, like a very diverse team from, it might be a research organization, IHEs, districts, teachers, the county office, that we're all coming together in service of a really clear goal that will improve outcomes for students. And yeah, over the years, there's just been, I think, some of the most exciting moments in my career have been around grants and what we've been able to accomplish and learn. And I think of, the research grant that we had a few years ago that then in part led into our equity grant. Knowledge and awareness around their students and how to better serve their students instructionally. It was career changing, life changing for a lot of people. That was really exciting.
And how fulfilling it must be, right, to say you did that and you were a part of that and your team were a part of that impactful and collective change that really did trickle down to a student. So I'm hoping our colleagues focus on that, because sometimes they might shy away from a grant or an opportunity because of the short timeline and the multiple routing steps we have to take. But when you weigh that with what you just shared, to me, I feel like the challenges are always going to be outnumbered by the potential impact and the significance that you can have on really students' academic well-being, academic achievement, their overall well-being. So I'm familiar with some of the grants that you've worked on, Julie. I've partnered with you on several applications and have always just been in awe of how much you bring to every application in the writing of it and then also in the implementation. So I value you and what you bring to SDCOE, and I know that the grants that you've put together have absolutely made an impact for the students in our county and really throughout the state, because you've had a couple statewide grants as well. So I thank you so much for your time and for joining us. And I hope our colleagues can connect with you moving forward if they just want a thought partner on, how do you make something just come to life that was, like you said, you told a story, but the implementation is the bringing it and breathing it life. And so I hope people can connect with you and be inspired the way I have. So thank you, Julie, for joining us.
Thank you.